Today is the birthday of one of the most interesting people in New York City history. I'm completely fascinated by this guy. He was born on April 3rd, 1823. William M. Tweed, or more popularly known as Boss Tweed.
Boss Tweed was a pretty charitable man, especially to the Irish Catholic immigrants. He ensured they had enough food, they had coal to heat their homes, and some money in their pocket. He even had the reading of the King James Bible removed from public schools. King James, King James Bible was Anglican, and Irish Catholics wouldn't go to school if that was going to be read. When he was in the New York State Senate, he had the government increase the contributions to the public schools and hospitals. Great guy, right? He also is said to be instrumental in naming of the Statue of Liberty.
Tweed's family were third generation Scottish immigrants, and Tweed was educated and trained as a bookkeeper. But that's not how he came to power. How he came to power is as a fireman, and he became prominent in his fire company. And you may be thinking of this scene when you're thinking about an 1800s fire department, but that's not it. Think more Gangs of New York fire department, and they did a great job, a pretty historically accurate job in the movie Gangs of New York. The fire companies are more like street gangs. They would extort the citizens, and then when a fire broke out, multiple companies would break out because they'd all want to be able to extort those citizens. And rather than fight the fire, they'd duke it out amongst themselves. And even if they were fighting the fire, they'd probably just steal everything of value in whatever building they were fighting the fire on. So William Tweed really made a name for himself with the Democrats when he was in the fire company. And he did it by wielding an axe. And he wasn't wielding the axe to knock down doors to help fight fires. It was in the street brawls. So the Democrats selected him, and very quickly he rose to power. He became a congressman for New York. And while he was there, the first thing he did was push a bill that moved the budget oversight from the feds to the local authorities. So he quickly no longer had any interest in being in Washington, D.C., and he moved back to New York, and he got himself elected as a New York State senator, which may seem counterintuitive. Normally people go from the local stage to the national stage. But when he did that, he was able to take over the Treasury and control the funds that he just moved to local control. So he was on the board, and the board was controlled by Democrats and Republicans, but what he would do would be he would bribe the Republicans that were the swing votes to get the funds to go where he wanted them to go.
So from that point on, William Tweed rose to power. He had control over those federal funds that were given to New York, and he started to rise in power in Tammany Hall, and that's when he started to become Boss Tweed. He started to take over more and more power within Tammany Hall. He had his hands in every project in New York City. At the height of his power, he was the third largest landowner in New York City. He even had a part in swindling money from Cornelius Vanderbilt in a stock scam. The Brooklyn Bridge, he was on the board, and he helped vote to ensure that the board had full financial control over the development of the bridge. And you know a lot of that was stolen. Those Irish Catholic immigrants that he was so charitable to, well, what he was doing was, as they came off the boat, he was paying them. And he was paying them to vote. He was paying them to vote multiple times in multiple locations. And he paid off policemen to go and make sure those Irish immigrants were in fact voting in multiple locations so he can ensure he got those votes. And if anybody tried to object to them voting multiple times, old Boss Tweed would have those cops who he paid off arrest them.
Boss Tweed's biggest example of corruption was the New York County Courthouse. The New York City legislature approved $250,000 to build this, which back around the 1860s was quite a bit of money. The brooms alone that Boss Tweed supposedly bought was $250,000. Plumbing for the building back then, he spent $1 million. Matter of fact, there were 3 tables and 4 chairs that cost $180,000. Back then, that would have funded 315,000 chairs. So obviously, there was a lot of graft going on. And all of the marble in the building, and if you've ever been there, there's quite a bit of marble. All of the marble was quarried from Tweed's own quarry. Yes, right before the construction started on the building, Tweed purchased a marble quarry. It took 20 years to build, and the final cost was somewhere between $11 million and $12 million. That is double the cost of Alaska.
So obviously, there's a lot of corruption going around, and Boss Tweed was becoming incredibly wealthy. He had his hands in everything. He was also a bit of a Robin Hood. He was basically stealing from the government and giving money to the common people. Those common people were voting for him and keeping him in power, especially those Irish immigrants. As there were more immigrants coming in, he was just buying their votes. But nothing lasts forever, and you can't please all the people all the time. Jimmy O'Brien thought he was being mistreated by Boss Tweed. So he walks into the New York Times and gives them a copy of the New York Ledger. Just hands it to him and then walks out. So at that point, the New York Times started to print articles using the ledger as the source, detailing Boss Tweed's actual corruption.
If this wasn't bad enough for Tweed, enter Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was an illustrator, a cartoonist, and he was very popular with Abraham Lincoln back in that day. Also, he was an ardent Republican, so he did have an axe to grind against Tammany Hall. And he started a stream of cartoons, and he was relentlessly hammering Boss Tweed on his corruption. And Boss Tweed had said, "I don't care a straw for your newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damn pictures." So that was pretty much the beginning of the end for Boss Tweed. He couldn't get away from the cartoons that Nast was hammering him with.
This all led to Boss Tweed being convicted twice. He served out his first sentence. Then in 1873, he was found guilty of 204 of 223 charges, and that led to a 12-year sentence. However, he had some privileges. He had a single cell, he had a library attached to his cell, and he had rights to go outside the jail. He was able to go on carriage rides through Central Park, and he was able to visit people. During one of these trips outside the jail, he escaped and went on the lam. Eventually, he changed his name to John Secker to escape the authorities, and he found his way to a ship that was going to Spain. The Spanish were alerted, but they didn't know what Boss Tweed looked like.
So the Spanish, not knowing who Tweed was, used Nast's cartoons to identify him. So when Tweed came off the ship, they were looking at the cartoons and they picked him out of the crowd. They captured him, sent him back to New York. So in New York, Tweed didn't want to go back to jail. So he was negotiating with the state to identify the whole circle of corruption, everybody involved. And he actually cut a deal that he'd be free if he sang. And he did. However, the government didn't believe him. And until this day, we're not quite sure if what Tweed was saying was true. So the government reneging on Tweed's deal has a ring of truth to it for sure. I don't think they were just being vindictive. They weren't sure if what he was saying was true at all. So in jail, Tweed stayed. And he finally died on April 12th, 1878, in the Ludlow Street Jail. And that's the end of the Tweed saga. However, Tammany Hall lived on. For a while, Tammany Hall tried to clean itself up. There were some reformers that came in, but it quickly went back to exploiting the immigrants to get the votes to keep themselves in power that would allow for corruption. And by the time the 1930s rolled around, the likes of Lansky, Luciano, and Costello were firmly entrenched, and they were paying off the immigrants and really rigging the elections so that they could stay in power, so that they can keep their mobster activities alive without being prosecuted, and they could also bilk the government. However, eventually, FDR came into power, realizing exactly what was going on, and he passed immigration reform that really limited the Irish from coming in, and it took them out of power. So Tammany Hall really after that wasn't a force to be reckoned with in New York City anymore. And by the time the 1960s rolled around, Tammany Hall was no more. So this is really an interesting character in New York City history. And it's an example of truth and history being a lot more entertaining than fiction.